We are very happy and honored that our speaker today is Professor Suzanne Stern-Gillet, who is going to talk on the concept of amartia in Plotinus. Please keep your microphones off. During the I'm sorry, but please keep your microphones off during the talk, and hopefully your cameras on. There will be a handout which I will share in a moment. So it gives me great pleasure to present Professor Stern-Gillet. Suzanne Stern-Gillet is Professor Emerita of Ancient Philosophy at the University of Bolton, and a honorary research fellow in the Department of Classics at the University of Manchester. Having studied both classics and philosophy in Belgium and in the United Kingdom at the universities of Liège and Manchester, she has taught in many universities in Europe and in the United States. Her research focuses on ancient Greek philosophy of the classical and post-classical period, mainly on Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. She is particularly interested in concepts of selfhood and virtue in ancient philosophy, as well as in theories of poetry and art. But in her early career, she translated Ryle's The Concept of Mind into French and published in the tradition of analytical philosophy. She is the author of Aristotle's Philosophy of Friendship and of more than 50 articles on moral psychology, epistemology, and ethics in the ancient thought, as well as editor or co-editor of 7 collective volumes. The last in date being a text worthy of Plotinus in 2021. She is now working on a monograph on Plato's Ion and on a new translation and commentary of Plotinus' Ennead 1-2 on the virtues. So Suzanne, I would like to thank you for your support and advice, and for having accepted our invitation. And I would like to thank you in a special way, that is by quoting a claim, an Aristotelian claim that you analyze in your book on friendship, namely that perceiving a friend is necessarily perceiving in a manner oneself, and knowing a friend is in a manner to know oneself. So thank you very much again, and the floor now is yours.
It gives me great pleasure to be with you today, and I'm very grateful to the organizers, Egyptian and Greek, for the invitation to contribute to the celebration of the 20 years that have elapsed since the foundation of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Plotinus is the perfect figure to study on this occasion. Although little is known of his early life, it is highly likely that he was Egyptian and that he chose to travel from his hometown in Lower Egypt to Alexandria to be instructed in philosophy by Ammonius Saccas, whom he later described as the man he had been looking for. What exactly he learned at the feet of Ammonius is not known. Ammonius, as you know, left no writings. But it seems likely that he provided Plotinus with the inspiration he needed to develop the form of Platonism that would prove to be the last flowering of Mediterranean rationalism. The relationship between Plotinus and Ammonius Saccas has given rise to speculations. The main one, as reported by Porphyry, is that Plotinus was accused of having plagiarized Ammonius's ideas. I shall leave aside such speculations, not only because the facts of the matter cannot be known, but mainly because if it is true that Western philosophy is a set of footnotes to Plato, and I believe it's true, then all of us at some time have been guilty of plagiarism. My contribution to this series of lectures is an exercise in micro-textual analysis, focusing on a puzzling contention that Plotinus makes in one of his best known and most frequently quoted early tractates. In the fourth chapter of the sixth Ennead, in the fourth chapter of the sixth Ennead on the descent of the soul into bodies, he comes close at some point to presenting the descent of the soul and its individuation and association with a body prepared for it by the world soul as a result of a twice occurring mistake. Sorry, I lost my, which a twice occurring mistake, a hamartia, which he comes later to regret on the ground that it had been a serious mistake. Plotinus, of course, did not fail to realize that the presentation of the penultimate stage of emanation as a fault or error ran against the key principle of his emanationism, according to which both the deployment of the soul and its association with the body is an eternally necessary stage in the emanative process that ensures the completion of the cosmos, or the all, as he sometimes likes to call it. To ward off the risk of incoherence, Plotinus argued in the second half of the tractate that the soul in us need not suffer harm from what he had described in the first half as a moral error on its part. If the soul in us, he writes in the second half, takes care not to participate over complacently in the life of the body, if it seeks to return to what is truly its better part, it might even have drawn a valuable lesson from its sojourn in the lower world. Paradoxically, therefore, the tractate ends on an upbeat note, with Plotinus arguing that the double hamartia that he had earlier accused of the soul was actually a very good thing for it. Now, as we all know, Plotinus was not the most terminologically prudent of philosophers. And the suggestion may be made that his questionable use of hamartia in Tractate 6 was nothing more than a blip, a soon forgotten inadvertence. Unfortunately, this was not so, because it can be argued that in a slightly later tractate, namely Tractate 10, he uses a similarly negatively connotated expression, namely tolma, audacity, to describe the descent of the individual soul. Tolma, he argues there, causes the descending soul to be oblivious of its high lineage in intellect and to sink more deeply than it should in the body. So the question has been raised. Is there a link between the two early mentions of a wrong turn taken by the descending soul? Are there signs that at the beginning of his writing life, Plotinus underwent the influence not only of Numenius, the Pythagorean, who held a very pessimistic conception of the soul, but also of the Gnostics who taught it in Rome at the time? In other words, did Plotinus' philosophy evolve fairly drastically in the course of the 17 years of his writing life? Dodds, for one, thought so. Unsurprisingly, the puzzling claims contained in Tractate 6, the claims about Hamartia, caused it to have a very bad press with modern commentators. So Breillet, Plotinus' thinking from chapter 4 onwards raises considerable difficulties. So Dodds, Plotinus' words are obscure. So John Deck, the argument involves a difficult mingling of themes. Its import is not clear. So Dennis O'Brien, the precise significance of the passage is not immediately clear. And so Blumenthal, who explains that the several difficulties and possible contradictions that he found in chapter 6 provided him with a motivation to write his book on Plotinus' psychology. Significantly, the double Hamartia passage comes as a direct consequence of one of the best known and most often quoted passages in the Enneads, in which Plotinus reports his own experience of uniting with the generating principle of his soul, intellect. This intensely personal soliloquy colors the rest of the tractate, giving it a less guarded tone than Plotinus adopts in the rest of the corpus. While the unitive experience, he tells us, brings a sense of wonder, the return to the confines of the body causes puzzlement and dismay. Because he speaks in his own name, while also suggesting that his experience is potentially paradigmatic, the lines impose themselves on the attention of receptive readers and leave them wishing or half wishing to undergo a similar experience themselves. Often described as mystical, and for that reason often quoted, the lines that Plotinus recount that, number 1 on your handout, in the translation of this. Often, after waking up to myself from the body, that is, externalizing myself in relation with other things, while entering into myself, I beheld a beauty of wondrous quality, and believe then that I'm most to be identified with my better part, that I enjoy the best quality of life, and have become united with the divine and situated within it, actualizing myself at that level and situating myself above all else in the intelligible world. Following on this repose in the divine and in bewilderment, how on earth did I ever come down here? However did my soul come to be enclosed in my body, being such as it has revealed itself to be, even while in the body? Plotinus's point in writing this passage was not, definitely not, to send his audience into a swoon, at least not immediately. He meant to invite them and us to follow him in the demanding philosophical investigation that he's about to undertake. As he would point out in Tractate 6-9, where the topic, which has an equal mystical potential, is the soul's union with the one, he points out that it is teaching, didaxis, that can lead us in the right direction, the direction of godlikeness, by providing us with lessons, logoi, that are intellectually demanding, in the sense of needing to be thought through and understood, katanoin. The support that Plotinus's didaxis gives to his metaphysics is what knits the Enneads together. And I think that's a very important point. So the striking opening lines of Tractate 6 fulfills an anagogic function. Listen to me so that you too can access the true wonder of what is real. Your soul, which may so far have been asleep in your body and all the other externals that go with it, can now be helped to wake up. You can be helped to behold the gold in yourself. And henceforth, while still embodied, live the life of virtue that closeness to and contact with the intelligibles will enable you to lead. Striking also in those lines is Plotinus's unbroken sense of his own identity. He knows all along that he is the same person. What he records is the experience of perceiving the chasm between the two kinds of life of which he is capable. On the one hand, a life of high value, truly his own, but also worthy to be called divine, consisting of a wakeful and alert repose in the eternity of intellect. And on the other hand, a life of humdrum and busy ordinariness, hemmed in by bodily needs and wants, and confined to the discursive mode of thinking, characteristic of the embodied state. Compared with a better life, the embodied life, to which she cannot but intermittently return, is a demotion. Why does it happen? How can it happen? Why are we in the body? Tractate 6 gives us Plotinus' answer to these questions. First, he turns to the tradition, to those he prettily calls the blessed men of ancient times, our pre-Socratics, before devoting his attention to Plato's complex answers to these questions. From the cavalier, not to say dismissive, tone with which he deals with his early predecessors, it is clear that he does not find them to be of much philosophical use. He rejects Heraclitus as obscure, Pythagoras on the ground that he expresses himself in riddling statements. Empedocles, too, he judges to be regrettably poetical, although still worthy to be quoted. From him, Plotinus quotes a few lines from what we now know as fragment 115 of the Catharmoi, a fragment that may have been put together from a miscellany of verses to which Plotinus is unlikely to have had direct access. Plotinus' source for the pre-Socratics is likely to have been anthologies, compendia, or more likely a long work by Plutarch. Plutarch always wrote long words, consisting of his commentaries on various Empedoclean sayings. I say more likely because a commentary without citations would explain the liberties that Plotinus took with the wording, the syntax, and even the meanings of Empedocles' line. According to Plotinus' report, Empedocles claims that it is a law, a nomos, that erring souls, hamartanusai psychai, should fall into the world. The soul, as Empedocles presents it, is a daimon, who, because of some wrongful act, amartētos, committed in the past, was cast off from the company of the blessed for thrice 10,000 seasons, and condemned to be born again through that period into all kinds of mortal shapes. Whatever the precise nature of the daimon's transgression, could be homicide, it could be eating animal flesh, it is clear that it involved a transgression of what we moderns would classify as a moral law, a transgression for which penalty would be exacted in successive stages of transmigration. To describe that moral wrong, Empedocles twice uses the verb hamartane, the very word whose cognate hamartia plays a crucial and puzzling role in our tractate. Furthermore, if unlike Plotinus, one goes beyond the mythical tone of the Empedoclean verses, it recalls an experience that matches not too badly the one that Plotinus describes in the opening lines of the tractate. Erring souls, hamartanusai psychai, Empedocles writes, fall into the world, pesai and thauta, as he himself did after he found himself a fugitive from the gods. I shall come back to those lines. When moving on from Empedocles, Plotinus turns to Plato's account of the descent of the soul into the world of sense. He is less deferential than one might expect. The divine Plato, he complains, does not say the same thing everywhere, so that it is very difficult to know what his intention is. Although Plotinus is less averse to criticizing Plato openly than he's often thought to be, Plotinus always tried to smooth away the contradictions and mend the gaps that he finds in the dialogues. He does so in this case. The main source of tension that he singles out on this occasion is well known. On the one hand, there is the negative theorization of the body that Plato gives in the Phaedo and other dialogues, and on the other hand, there is a Timaeus in which we get a positive description of the cosmos as a blessed God. Denigration of all things bodily is indeed a feature of most Platonic dialogues. To wit, the Phaedo, as Socrates claims that the soul of the philosopher most disdains the body, flees from it, and seeks to be by itself. The Cratylus has the body compared to a tomb. The Republic presents the body as keeping the soul tied down to the world of sense, thereby causing it to be blind to the intelligible reality outside the cave. The Phaedrus dramatically describes the souls weighed down by forgetfulness and vice as losing the wings that would otherwise have kept their sight on the plane of truth. The Theaetetus, as Socrates argued, that a man should make all haste to escape from earth to heaven, and escape means becoming like God as possible. And lastly, Book 7 of the Laws has Megillus go into considerable detail to show how bodily passions deprive human souls of whatever freedom of choice they would possess if they had acted from reason rather than sense. By contrast, in the Timaeus, Plato gives us a description of the meticulous care deployed by the demiurge to ensure that the body of the cosmos is whole and complete, so as to make it worthy to be called a blessed God. So Plotinus, finding the pre-Socratic tradition lacking in clarity, largely dismissed it and turned to confront the discrepant statements on the relation between soul and body that he found in Plato. To do so, he had a very strong strategy. His own emanative ontology, tightly structured, and dare I say, far more subtle than anything to be found in Plato. As you will recall, Plotinus outlines how from within the primal unity of the one good, the stages of emanation eternally proceed from intellect to hypostatic soul, which in turn deploys itself in several manifestations, each further particularized by the demands made of it through the body to which it is associated. It is at the penultimate stage of the descent, which sees the emergence of individuated souls, katechasta souls, Plotinus' own soul, yours, mine, each of which is associated with a body, that the discrepancy between the Timaeus and the rest of the Platonic corpus can be eased. The individuated human soul is an amphibious reality, able to orient itself at two different levels, either upwards to her prior, from which it is emanated, or downwards to level of the body it is associated with, a body that it has the function of animating and keeping whole. So, conceiving the individuated soul as an amphibious reality, Plotinus could make it the go-between that links the lower world of embodied things to the high world of the intelligibles, thereby addressing the tension in Plato's metaphysics. Embodied souls, he writes, have an intelligent desire, orexis noera, to remain or to return to the principle from which they are emanated, and of which they keep traces, tupoi, in themselves. But they also have an antithetical power directed towards this world, like a light which is attached on its upper side to the sun, but which on its lower side does not begrudge what service it can provide. It is this double power of the soul that enables it to play a diacosmic, demiurgic role in the formation and completion of a harmonious physical cosmos. Ethics enters the Ennead at this point. while the individuated human soul is to take care of the body, it may find this one aspect of its function to be easier, the wider gate to proceed, as opposed to the narrow road to which the higher part of its nature beckons it. The soul which leads to the temptation finds itself in charge of a body which, as a result, gets inevitably more demanding and thus more difficult to control. As a result, the soul who makes that choice or grows weaker isolates itself further from the high world of the intelligibles, operates in time, and may even come close to lose contact altogether with its prior. In Plotinus's words, the individuated soul at that point, number 2 on your handout, has failed in its blameless cooperation. I'm reading a contracted version to save time. So the individuated soul at that point has failed in its blameless cooperation, hamartētos, to ablabus in the administration of the better alternatives, which involved remaining with the universal soul. The soul has fallen. Note, if you would, the occurrence of our problematic word, hamartētos, to denote the failure of the individuated soul as it effectively cuts itself off from the better part of its amphibious nature, or deviates from it, as Breyer's felicitous translation has it, and sinks into its own product, the body. It is at this point that we come across the first sign of tension in Plotinus's presentation of the soul's embodiment. The tension is manifest if we compare what he calls in the above passage the failure of the individual soul to remain blamelessly in cooperation with universal soul, with a statement that he will make in Tractate 13 to the effect that in the last stages of emanation, the individuated soul, having covered matter with form, creates an image into which it joyfully goes into. So either it misses the boat or it joyfully goes into. There's a blatant contradiction here. The use of hamartētos in chapter 4, Tractate 6, is all the more troubling that he had hit upon another far less compromising, far more prudent way of putting the point in an earlier tractate, when he wrote, "One must view the nature of each thing rather by looking at its purified state, since the state that accrues from without tends always to get in the way of knowledge of that to which it accrues." Unquote. Interestingly, most translators, sensing trouble at that point, avoid giving hamartētos the full negative connotation that it has in the failed perception passage. Do these wary translators, always distrust translators, do these wary translators seek to avoid intimating that Plotinus here turns his back on his conception of the soul as amphibious? Possibly, but if so, the translator need not have worried, since, as the rest of the quoted passage makes clear, Plotinus holds, and this is a very important point, that no matter how deep our soul sinks into external particularities, it cannot but remain amphibious, which means in turn that our soul can always lift itself off from what he likes to describe as the mud and the filth of the body. Pelos and bobos, I love these words. So much is built into a double axiom that lies at the very foundation of his metaphysics. Namely, axiom number 1, nothing of real being perishes. And 2, evil cannot be in what really exists. From that double axiom, 2 inferences can be drawn regarding the being of the soul. First, soul, qua soul, cannot die or be changed into another nature. And second, Soul, qua soul, cannot be impaired in any fundamental way or be other than good. In Plotinus's words, it's part of the second passage on your handout. Once the soul turns itself back towards intellection, it is said to be freed from its bonds and to assent when it has taken its start in contemplating beings from its exercise in recollection. For, despite everything, and always remember these words, everything that's soul always retains some element of the transcendent. The soul always keeps something that he described as pipere conti. So, if it is axiomatic that divine beings, in the case the soul, cannot be other than good, why does it commit hamartia? Not only once, but twice. Here is the offending passage, which is, of course, on your handout number 3. Now, accepting that there are two stages of moral error, the one connected with the cause of the initial descent, the other with whatever vicious deeds one might commit when down here. The first is punished precisely by that very thing, what it experiences in the initial descent, while the nature of the second, when less serious, causes it to enter one body after another, and the more quickly to proceed to judgment according to its due. The fact that it indeed comes about by divine ordinance is indicated by the very name judgment, while the immoderate type of vice merits punishment of a more serious nature under the supervision of the avenging demons. Unquote. On the surely reasonable assumption that hamartia is used in the same sense of error or fault in its two occurrences in the passage, the first time of the descending soul, the second time of the descended soul, our first concern is to establish the precise meaning of the terms. According to Chantren's still authoritative Dictionnaire étymologique de la langue grecque, hamartanein and its cognates, from Homer onwards, can denote an error of judgment, a moral fault, or a failure to reach one's aim, which is the sense that it has in the last passage I quoted. My own, admittedly exceedingly modest investigations into the use of hamartanein and its cognates in the literature of the classical period bear Chantren out. In some contexts, it denotes a morally culpable error, while in others, it designates an error or a mistake of a purely cognitive nature. Here are 3 examples of its use in the literature of the classical period, likely to have been familiar to Plotinus. 1. In the opening scene of the Aeschylean Prometheus-bound Kratos power, described to Hephaestus Prometheus's offense and the rationale for his punishment, as follows. It was the flower of your craft he stole, bright fire, the origin of every art, stole and handed to mortals. For this wrong, he must pay the penalty the gods exact. That's, of course, on your handout, number 4. There cannot be any doubt that the theft of fire was taken to have been a moral offense for which retribution was due in accordance with justice, here conceived as emanating from the gods. In the Agamemnon, in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Cassandra refers to the ancient wrongdoings of this house in her address to the chorus, number 5 on the handout. And the ancient wrongs to which she refers are clearly of a moral nature. Lastly, the concluding words that the goddess Artemis addresses to Theseus in Euripides' Hippolytus ran, this is number 6 on your handout, ignorance acquits your misdoing of baseness. And further, the death of your wife made impossible the testing of her words, and thus she persuaded your mind. Now, these Euripidean lines show that hamartia denotes a moral offense, the seriousness of which is taken to be negated by the agent's ignorance of crucial aspects of the situation. And the lines show that by the time the play was written, long before Plotinus was born, the distinction between moral faults and cognitive errors was well in place. Plato's usage is far more complex. While he often uses hamartia to designate a mistake of a cognitive nature, and there are plenty of examples in the Republic, he does attach unmistakable moral connotations to the word in the eschatological myth, and more generally in all contexts where a retributive theory of punishment is assumed. And that is actually a puzzling fact about Plato's concept of punishment. Particularly clear examples are provided in the eschatological myth of the Phaedo, and even more so in the one in the Republic, where Socrates, in an exchange with Glaucon, in the exchange that precedes the narration of the myth of Earth, introduces the concept of divine retribution for wrongdoings, hamartiae, committed by the soul in its incarnate existence. In those passages, punishment is presented not indeed as a measure to educate and reform offenders, as it would be in the Protagoras, but as retaliation meted out in the afterlife for misdeeds committed in this life. Retaliation calculated to be proportionate to the heinousness of the crime and the wickedness of the perpetrator. It has, of course, not escaped the attention of scholars that the fire and brimstone manner in which the retributive theory of punishment is generally presented in the eschatological myth is at variance with the reformatory theory of punishment, which elsewhere in the corpus, Plato has Socrates support with analytical arguments. Of particular significance to the present context is the type of discourse adopted by the Platonic Socrates to defend the two alternative theories of punishment. While the retributivist conception is couched in poetic, religious, and even mystical language, the reformatory conception is put forward in abstract and analytical terms. Although there is to date no consensus of opinion as to why Plato should have put forward two widely different or even discrepant conceptions of punishment, most scholars who have looked at the issue draw attention to the ancient sources, religious and literary for the most part, which are likely to have weighed upon Plato as he composed this myth of the afterlife. This is the point at which I want to return to Empedocles, to suggest that there is an element of intertextuality in Plotinus's use of hamartanēn and hamartia to account for the descent and embodiment of individual souls. Since Plotinus's first move in addressing the opening question of the tractate, how did my soul come to be joined to my body, was to turn to ancient sources, it is not surprising that when he came to spelling out his own views, the style of his answer would bear the stamp of these earlier philosophers whose opinions he had recorded. The poetic vigor with which Empedocles in particular had accounted for what he called the law that decrees punishment for those, be they daimones or others, were found guilty of unspecified hamartiae, would have likely caused his words to remain in Plotinus's memory. The impression might even have been reinforced by the archaic and oracular language in which Plato narrates his myth of the afterlife, myth in which reincarnation is presented as either punishment or reward for a life lived here below. Therefore, as I read chapter 5 of Tractate 6, Plotinus is not only stating his own answer to the question as to how the soul comes to be present to a particular body, he's also situating his answer within the framework of the tradition to which he sees himself as belonging. If this is indeed what he's doing here, what could be more natural for him than to couch his answer in the language of his predecessors? Indeed, in the few lines that precede his own mention of hamartia, he makes the point of telling us that it is not only in his own name that he is speaking, but that he is also summarizing the views of others. When he writes, and I'm quoting, "Everything that goes to the worse does so unwillingly. But since it goes by its own motion, when it experiences the worse, it is said, legatai, to be punished for what he did." It's not me who says it, it is the tradition that says it. When we turn to Plotinus's own writings, we find that hamartia most often denotes a moral error or flaw, with only very few passages in which the word is taken as cognitive. Thus, in the day part of the troubling passage, the passage on the double hamartia, the second hamartia is clearly a moral error, since it refers to the bad actions, the kakadrasai, that human souls are guilty of during the time of their embodiment. They denote what Shakespeare called the evil that men do. Since the they part of the sentence could not possibly fail to refer back on the men part of it, in which the descent of the soul is ascribed to a hamartia on its part, I conclude that the descending soul too is to be interpreted as committing a moral error, which is indeed how Gerson and his team of translators have interpreted it. Let me here get something off my chest now. I want to note en passant that Plotinus's hamartia should never, ever be rendered as sin. McKenna and Armstrong, both of whom so render it consistently and all the time, project onto Plotinus Christian connotations of sin, understood either as an individual offense committed against the deity, or in the case of original sin, as a condition reflecting the fall of man consequent upon Adam's rebellion. Of course, the translation of hamartia by sin is entirely appropriate in the context of patristic literature. Well, no matter how we account for Plotinus's imprudent, to say the least, use of hamartia, it must be admitted that in the context of Tractate 6 as a whole, it creaks, and it creaks badly. As indeed, Plotinus appears to have recognized when we look at the compensating evidence that he dotted around the tractate, especially in the latter chapters. The compensating evidence to compensate for this unfortunate use of hamartia, as I attempt to gather the evidence, is in 4 parts. There's quite a lot. First, Plotinus's encomium of the world of sense is a striking feature of the tractate. And this is highly significant insofar as Plotinus, in common with many of his Platonist predecessors, held a transmission conception of causality, according to which a cause transmits its property to its effect, albeit in a diminished manner. This being so, it can be inferred that he would not have praised so unreservedly the work of the soul in the physical world, if he had held that it comes about as the effect of a morally tarnished cause, a moral hamartia on the part of the descending soul. Later, he would reiterate the point in his attack on the Gnostics, by remarking that there could not be a fairer image of the intelligible world than the perceptible cosmos as we know it. Second compensating move. In chapter 2, we had already tried to reassure the soul that no harm need come to it through its association with body, on the ground that, and I'm quoting, not every kind of provident care for the inferior need deprive the being exercising it of its ability to remain in the highest, unquote. Although the tone is guarded and the point negatively put, Plotinus devotes a sizable part of the later chapters to the justification of this positive view. Third compensating mechanism. In chapter 5, he writes that since the soul descends to meet the need of something else, it can truly be said to have been sent by God. Fourth compensating mechanism. In chapter 7, he draws the soul attention to the fact that it does not need to come empty-handed from its demiurgic work in the world of sense. The soul brings something back, metalambane, for the experience of evil acquired in the process may result in a clearer knowledge of the good. This is a very dicey point, but we won't go into it. Fifth and last compensating mechanism. In chapter 7, he summarizes all the above points by saying that the soul must not be discontented with itself. Ok aganakteteon, is a hapax, since its function as a divinity of median rank gives it gives it the possibility of passing on what it eternally receives from the higher to the lower world. At this point, I'll rest my case. I hope to have convinced you that although Plotinus' use of hamartia in tractate 6 has him sailing very close to the wind, too close for comfort, there are nonetheless solid grounds, stylistic as well as exegetical, to doubt that tractate 6 contains evidence of an early flirtation with Gnosticism. That, however, is not the end of the story. For in a passage that is terminologically very close to the one we've just been looking at, Plotinus accuses the soul of audacity, tolma, in harboring an exaggerated desire for independence, a desire which in turn leads it to forget the father. Tolma, I hold it on the authority of Professor Kalligas, comes from a Doric dialect. As a result of its ancient past and uncertain sources, it carries connotations so tangled, so uncertain to decipher, that it is difficult to establish with precision the meaning that it carries in its fairly rare occurrences in the Enneads. In applying to the soul, was Plotinus indebted once more to Numenius, and through him to assorted Neo-Pythagoreans or Gnostics of various descriptions, who made various otherworldly entities responsible for introducing multiplicity in the world of sense? The question arises because Platonic tolma, unlike its Plotinian counterpart, appears to have been a relatively tame concept, which can denote a mindless excess of courage. What prompted Plotinus to put the mild Platonic tolma to such radical philosophical use? I'm not going to devote much time to this question, not only because time is pressing, but also because the passage in question, which is number 7 on your handout, has benefited from the attention of excellent commentators, from Fernand Brunner to Michael Atkinson to Eric Pearl, to all of whom I'm here indebted. Here is the passage in Eric Pearl's translation. It's, of course, on your handout. Where whatever it is then that has made souls be oblivious of their Father God, and although there are portions from there and altogether his, be ignorant of both themselves and him. The principle of badness for them is audacity, tolma, and becoming, and the first otherness, and willing to belong to themselves. The beginning of evil for them was audacity, and coming to birth, and the first otherness, and the wishing to belong to themselves. Since they appear to delight in independence and indulge excessively in being moved by themselves, running in the opposite direction and getting far away, they were ignorant of what they themselves are from. Unquote. As he had done in chapter 6, Plotinus is here relying on normative vocabulary to ascribe intentions to metaphysical entities. Clearly, the souls that he has here in mind are individual embodied souls, which equally clearly he takes to be blameworthy for having deliberately, of their own volition, voulethenai, turned their attention away from the higher world and concentrated on themselves. Insofar as the wish to belong to themselves is presented as a first step in the individual soul self-alienation and descent into evil, arche to kaku, it corresponds pretty closely to our troubling passage in Tractate 6. By outlining the reason why the soul makes its first step into what turns to be self-alienation, the first line of Tractate 10 fills what had been left blank in Tractate 6. It answers the question, what could have caused the soul, by explaining that it was their self-concern that made them Ptolemaic and prone to neglect the divine nature they had received from their prior. Belonging by right to the high world, Ptolemaic souls misdirect their attention to something that is other than themselves. Similarly, negative value-loaded terminology is used in a sprinkling of other tractates written during Plotinus' early pre-Porphyrian period. Thus, in Tractate 2, a demiurgic desire or impulse is ascribed to the descending soul. In Tractate 11, the suggestion is made that the soul becomes more audacious and excessively stupid, tolmerotaton kai aphronestaton, as it proceeds towards the lowest level of the natural world. It was again passages like this that prompted Dodds to claim that Plotinus's early writings contain evidence of prognostic leanings, from which he would finally anticipate himself in Tractate 33. There are, however, good reasons to disagree with Dodds. Firstly, Plotinus does not say that the soul's wish to belong to itself is evil, but that it is the beginning of evil, a well-attested meaning of arche. Second, as pointed out by Fernand Brunner in an article that would deserve to be referred more often, the apostasis of the soul described in the tolma passage need not be an independent act of active rebellion of the soul against its prior, as much as an exercise of a power that is innate in it. Third, as pointed out by Michael Atkinson, the word tolma had disappeared from Plotinus's vocabulary long before he composed the anti-Gnostic tractate. Fourth, the use of tolma in the opening lines of Tractate 10 is based on the assumption that the individual embodied soul, whose apostasy is deplored, is within the remit of persuasion. And that is a point I made earlier regarding the role that Plotinus attached to teaching in support of his attempt to persuade his audience onto the high road of contemplation. Teaching, Plotinus held, can enlighten the soul and correct whatever erroneous opinion it had held before. It can correct false moves on its part. As a reading of the Tractate 10 as a whole suggests, the remarks on the negative impact of tolma on the soul comes as a prelude to the sustained attempt in that tractate to persuade the soul back to its true home from the self-alienation generated by a lack of attention to its high lineage. The plethora of words with a cognitive import used in that chapter, repeated use of didaskein, agnoein, and its cognates, as well as the opposition between epilanthanestai and anamimneskai, show tolma to be here conceived as a fault of a mostly cognitive but corrigible nature. These few remarks on the vexed concept of tolma do not quite mark the end of the story, for Plotinus' penultimate tractate, 1.1, show him to have had final thoughts on the association between soul and body. To those I'll now very briefly turn. As should by now be clear, Plotinus never quite overcame the difficulty he had in accounting for the descent of human souls into body, and as a consequence for the nature of the relation between soul and body. Since he consistently held that evil cannot be in what really exists, and that soul qua such is impassible, apathes, concepts such as hamartia and tolma could play no central part in his metaphysics of the soul. When, at the end of his life, blissfully away from Porphyry's watchful eye, he came to revisit the question and give us his best thoughts on these issues in a terse and intensely dialectical tractate. He further developed the view, first broached in his early tractates, that the soul in us never altogether comes down, but stays in the intelligible realm. What the soul does, Plotinus argues in the central chapters of that tractate, is to project traces or shadows of itself in the form of powers, dynamis, onto the body, so as to make possible the receipt in the compound of both sense perception and afflictions such as fear, grief, and desire, all of which might otherwise be assumed to require cooperation between soul and body. As he writes, penultimate quotation on your handout, in Gerard O'Daly's translation, the power of the soul's perception is a power able to apprehend the impressions produced from sensation in the living being, for these are really already intelligibles. Thus, external sensation is a likeness of this power of the soul, whereas it is in its essence truer, being a contemplation of forms alone. Impassibly, it is from these forms alone, from which the soul alone already received leadership upon the living being, that reasoning and opinions and intellection come from. You will, of course, have recognized that it is at this point that Plotinus introduces his conception of levels of selfhood, into which we fortunately do not need to go at the moment. What, by contrast, we do need to note is the impact that the concept of soul traces and powers have on the responsibility that accrues to the soul in us for the evils that we do, for our errors of judgment, our false imaginings, and all manner of evil occasioned by uncensored emotions. At this point, Plotinus' verdict is pellucid. For once, the soul in us remains unfailingly anamartētos. It does not commit hamartia. And here is the passage, the last on your handout. So the nature of that soul of ours will be free from responsibility for all evils that man does and suffer. These have to do with the living thing, the common entity, and common as it has been described. But if opinion and reasoning are proper to the soul, how is it free from error? Now, evils are done when we are overcome by what is worse, for we are multiple, by desire or anger or an evil image. And so-called thinking what is false, being an imagining, has not waited for the judgment of the reasoning faculty, but we have acted, persuaded by what is worse. Just as in the case of perception, it happens that the common perception sees falsely before the reasoning faculty passes judgment. as Plotinus here clearly recognizes the ascription in tractate 6 and 10 of a double hamartia, or of a form of tolma to the descending soul, had been a very rash assumption on his part. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for this masterful talk. I am sure there must be many questions. So please use the chat if possible. A Q would be enough, because this would allow me to keep the order. But of course, raise hand is also an option. So although I may not be able to keep the correct order. So Professor Altman.
Thank you very much. Suzanne, I'm going to give you the choice of 3 questions, or if you don't like, I'll sketch them briefly. Or if you don't like any of them, I have a criticism. So the 3 questions that I want to ask you, one follows from your ongoing work on the ion, and I wanted to ask you a specific question about the relationship between Plotinus and the ion. Second question kind of relates to you and the continuity of your thought going back to the Ryle translation. I have a question about that relating to the way you discussed Plato and the Timaeus in this talk. And then the third thing is more specific to your talk. It focuses on the way you treated the opening moments of 4-8, 6 as you call it. And there's a specific passage in chapter 5 that I'd like to ask you about in the context of that. So those are my 3 questions. Pick one if you want to answer it. If not, I'll just give you briefly my criticism.
Well, I may choose to address your questions if there are no others that grab my attention. Permit me to point out that when I translated the concept of mind by Gilbert Ryle, whom I like very much as a person and as a writer, I was a research student in Tübingen in Germany, and that was a long time ago. I have drawn from Gilbert Ryle an attempt to be extremely precise in my choice of words. And at the beginning of my study of Plotinus, I was repelled by the complacent use of mythical, beautiful terminology. People tended to read Plotinus to contemplate. What did they contemplate? I wanted to know. And as someone who has spent a good 2 years putting my French words into Ryle English words, I found this very, very annoying. So I had to teach myself to read Plotinus in another way. I had to react against my analytical colleagues in Oxford who described Plotinus as a mystic. And I said, it isn't a mystic. He's a font of very good arguments. If only you took the trouble of opening the Enneads. So that's my take. I'm not blind to Gilbert Ryle's faulty concept of imagination. I am not blind to his very odd concept of introspection, which I have been able to use when I discuss Augustine's Confessions. So that's all I can tell you at the moment about Gilbert Ryle. I miss him. I think he was a very great philosopher with his flaws, but he certainly taught me a lot. About the ion, my goodness, that was written more recently, and it was prompted by what I conceived as a wrong attempt to argue that Plato was not against the poets, you know. Oh, not at all. And people who think that, they have a view of Plato that I think, cannot be sustained by a very careful reading of the dialogue. But that's, again, I mean, yeah. I suppose it's me who was brought up in the analytical tradition, both as an undergraduate and a graduate student, rebelling against fuzzy, woolly approaches to the great men of the past. So, okay, now what was your third question? Oh, the reading of the Timaeus. Well, I haven't done much on the Timaeus. I've just said that it presents a positive view.
Just one more word on the ion, which is the word anamartētos. In other words, in the ion myth, the Socrates magnet myth, he uses the verbs, 3 of them. And what I've been very struck by in reading Plotinus is how often Plotinus uses those verbs. Anartēstai is the very last verb in 6-7. And I see a lot more influence of the ion on Plotinus, especially on the mythic aspect in Socrates, magnet speech, than I was prepared to find. That was what I wanted to ask you about specifically about Plotinus.
Well, thank you very much. I had not noticed that, and I need to address the question.
Okay, great.
Which I will, having given credit to you for raising it.
Thank you.
Zdenek?
Yes, do you hear me? Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, because if I understood well, you are at least 2 points. The first was that there is a double hamartia in Plotinus, one cognitive error and the other the moral fault. So cognitive and ethics, so to say. And the second point that I get, that it was that Plotinus may be reminiscent of Empedocles, specifically on some points.
Yes, I did say that, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I have 2 main questions, and both questions are taking as a medium, a mediator between Empedocles and Plotinus. You said
between Empedocles and
Plotinus.
Oh yeah.
Plato's Phaedrus, more specifically, because there is this passage where Socrates, between his first speech and the second speech, between the myth, precisely the eschatological myth and the fall of the wings and so on, as you described it, says twice at least, I did an error, and I discovered the word. I searched for the word, but actually it is not hamartia, but it is twice hamartema. I don't know if there is a difference, but hamartema is quite proximate to hamartia. And so Socrates, introducing his second speech, before taking the guise of Stesichorus, which may be reminiscent of Empedocles himself, says we did twice an error. And this twice amartema may be purified because our logoi, our previous logos concerning eros, were twice deinon. They were stupid, so maybe cognitive error, and they were impious, so maybe moral fault, more or less. So I would like to know if you don't think that Plotinus, more specifically in Treaty 6, but also in Treaty 10, isn't reminiscent directly of his fault which need a purification, precisely avoiding this fall of the wings and the definitive fall of the soul, which is not actual for Plotinus, because and this is my second point, at the same time, your text 1 concerning Treaty 6 and your text 7 concerning Treaty 10 may be reminiscent of the beginning of the Phaedrus, where Socrates famously wonders whether he participates in a divine destiny, tia moira. And the first text, Treaty 6, says, with my better part, tes kretoinos moiras, and your text 7, referring to Treaty 10, says souls are portions from there, moiras ekaten. And I think that with those explicit quotations, like your text 2, to the molting of fevers and so on, coming from the Phaedrus, I wonder if there is not a kind of debate going on between Plotinus and others, let's say Gnostics, maybe in Treaty 10 at least, concerning the interpretation of Plato's Phaedrus.
Okay, now what a rich and interesting question. Let me attempt to say a few things. The two speeches by Socrates, yes, that's very interesting. On the question of hamartia and amartema, my guess, and I'm not a philologist, I would have thought, but maybe Dr. Viltanioti could enlighten us. My impression is that hamartema is a more abstract word than hamartia. Amartema appears to me to be the kind of word philosophers would use in arguments, as opposed to amartia. But I don't know. I need to ask someone who's more competent in ancient Greek. Now, another point that I occasionally make when I write or teach the Phaedrus is that the palynode is Stesichorus' palynode. And that is not often noticed. People take it that it is Socrates' palynode. It's Stesichorus' palynode. Now, the significance of this is not entirely clear to me, but it certainly cuts the grass under those people who like to claim that Plato loved poetry, actually. Maybe he did at times, but he quite made sure that the reader of the Phaedrus knew that Stesichorus wrote the palynode. So that's the point. Your other points, yes, they are all good. And I was wondering whether at some point you would mind repeating them or sending me a note, because I think they're very good. The beginning of the Phaedrus, which finds Socrates and his friends in a holy, so to speak, place. It also brings me to mind the Oedipus at Colonus. This place is full of gods. So, you know, what Plotinus read in classical literature is not terribly well known. But as you point out, as you start reading, and as Professor Altman made the point earlier on, you find all kinds of links. That is what makes reading philosophy as well as Greek literature of the classical period such a rewarding exercise, because you find all kinds of things. So have I not answered to something you pointedly asked me to do? It's a question from me to you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Just to take the point on Stesichorus, I agree totally with you that it would be maybe a mistake to take too simply the fact that, like to say Socrates equals Stesichorus equals Socrates equals Plato, and Plato is so poetic and so on. Most of all because Socrates Stesichorus, so to say, says explicitly that he is going to be poetic, or at least at the end of the palynode he says that he was poetic because of Phaedrus. So it is certainly because maybe of the soul he addresses that he is going to be more poetical. But on Stesichorus, I just wonders to make more clearly my point on Empedocles and Plotinus. I think there is a lot of arguments to show that Socrates Stesichorus may be a kind of Platonic reinterpretation or even subversion of Empedoclean theory of purification and even Empedocles' theory of eros, maybe, or philotis, and so on. So I mean that in Treaty 6 and Treaty 10, the Empedoclean reminiscence in Plotinus may pass through the medium of Plato's Phaedrus himself doing a kind of subversion of Empedocles by the guise, the mask of Stesichorus, maybe.
Right, about that, well, I do not specialize in pre-Socratic thought, because when I work, I like a body of work containing arguments through which I can go with my red pen. But I can tell you that currently, well, the book has just come out, I think 6 months ago in French, if you can read French, about that aspect of Empedocles, about the beginning of ethical thought in Empedocles. I can give you the name. The name of the person is Jean-Claude Picot.
Je pensais à ça. Je pensais à lui.
Sorry?
Je pensais à lui. I was thinking about precisely these French studies.
Yeah. So you will find, I hope, much grist to your mill in that book. Now there's something else. Oh yes, about Stesichorus and poetry. This is all fine, but I hadn't read the Phaedrus within the last 2 years, but I seem to remember that in that part of the dialogues where several forms of theamoirai are listed, there is a claim that the function of poets is to celebrate the great deeds of the men of ancient times. That's what their brief is confined to, celebratory. And I cannot forget either that somewhere else towards the end of the dialogue, the poets are the penultimate in the list of worthy characters. So the Phaedrus is a celebration of poetry. Don't know. Don't be too enthusiastic. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Sauder, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your paper, which gave me a lot of new things to think about in these classical texts. I wanted to talk a little bit about tolma, something that I'm interested in. You mentioned Plato's uses of that. You also mentioned an article by Paul Kaligas. Maybe you could tell me what you were citing.
Whom?
Kaligas.
Professor Kaligas. Yeah. Oh, it's not an article that he wrote. It's something he told me.
Okay.
In the course of the conversation, I said, "Why does he use tolma? This is an odd word." No. And so, as we were eating, he delivered of himself of the opinion that it was a Doric word.
That was my first question. Second question was, so you asked a little bit the Dodds question. Did he get this from the Gnostics, etc.? I guess I would like to put out there the possibility of another tolma tradition, which would go back even, or maybe a tradition common to these Gnostic descent narratives and to Plotinus. And that is the whole kind of milieu of sort of quasi Pythagorean talk about the unlimited dyad, where tolma also comes up. So in Plutarch, for instance, Isis and Osiris, you can find this even in Philo, for instance, and not just tolma, but there's a lot of this kind of kinesis, movement, language, around all that discussion of one and infinite dyad. You can find in Der Ursprung der Geistesmetaphysik, in Kramer, the larger context there, of which tolma is a part, it seems to me. So I wanted to see your thought about that.
That is a very good point. That is an extremely good point. And you are taking me into a territory that I'm a little uneasy about, because I should know Numenius better than I do. And yes. That the Neo-Pythagorean angle is something that should be added to the paper. I would have thought, actually, that it was more likely to be Neo-Pythagorean through Numenius then it would be Gnostic. But you clearly are a specialist and I'm not. You see, I don't know Numenius very well, but I have read it in both Desplaces and George Boystone's rendering, which is very good. And I find Numenius sometimes a little hard to pin down. You know, I like to pin down people in a very specific place. I can't do that very much with Numenius. What about Alkinos? Do you find anything there?
I do not know of a specific use of the word tolma in Alkinus. Actually, also in Numenius, I mean, there's definitely that Neo-Pythagorean infinite dyad motif, but not that I can think of the word tolma. It's in, there is, well, I was thinking of something else. There's a fragment, fragment 13 from Aristotle on the Pythagoreans, where he talks about a kinesis of the multiplicity coming out of the dyad, but not tolma. So the Gnostics, there's a lot of tolma in the Gnostics, definitely, but I think that they're kind of getting it out of that very hazy sort of Neo-Pythagorean milieu for which we have, you know, so little textual basis for. I mean, that's one of the problems with Numenius, certainly, that we have so little of Numenius left.
You say the Gnostics, or the Gnostics' influence on Plotinus are currently much researched. And I think it would be, it'd be difficult to deny that there are people in our family of Neoplatonists who tend to see a Gnostic under every bed, as John Dillon once put it to me. They certainly have drawn our attention to interesting bits. But take tolma. Take tolma in Tractate 10. Tolma recurs later on in Tractate 10 when it is assigned to the intellect. Now, I think that, and our friend, the late lamented Zeke Mazur, made much of this passage, that even intellect is guilty of tolma. Nah, come on, that can't be true. But yeah, or would you want to defend that?
Well, I think that Professor Altman has a new question. Is that correct, or?
Well, it just follows directly on that. I'm glad you mentioned Zeke there. I mean, the criticism I had for your paper was that you seem to rely primarily on Dodds for the theory that there was a Gnostic influence on, I mean, that was the only one you mentioned, and you mentioned him twice, is the Gnostic influence on Plotinus. And obviously Zeke Mazur's work makes that a very out-of-date statement. I think that if you're really going to try to say that, I mean, Nag Hammadi came along, like nobody was paying much attention to the Gnostics before Nag Hammadi. So there's been a big effort to sweep them under the table long before. So now that we've got Nag Hammadi and we have a genius in Zeke Mazur to kind of illuminate the use of tolma and its applicability to Plotinus, I don't think we shouldn't go back to Dodds no.
Dawes is a great ancestor. It makes me feel such a big girl when I can disagree with Dawes and have arguments.
Oh, I agree with that.
Oh, I can't resist.
But okay, so one last, since we agree on that, just one last point. It seems to me that with your Stesichorus point about distinguishing between the great second speech by identifiedist, it seems to me, and this would be a criticism of your pal Plotinus, it seems to me that there is nobody in the history of thought that has more systematically overlooked the possibility that the speaker of the great second speech in the Phaedrus is Stesichorus than Plotinus. He takes it as gospel Platonism from one end to the other. There's never a hint that he recognized anything about the dialectical nature of the Phaedrus, never a hint that he recognizes that the speech belongs to Stesichorus or has anything false in it, as Socrates himself claims that it does in the analytical section of the Phaedrus, to which our friend Plotinus indeed pays no attention whatsoever. So what's your response to that, Professor?
I can't say that I follow all this. I mean, I'm not the only person to have noticed that Stesichorus is the true author of the Palinode. I can tell you who, like me, there is a very famous grammarian of ancient Greek called Albert Reichsbaron. Now, this man paid me the best compliment I have ever received. I wrote this article on the Ion, published in Phronesis, and he said, "You prompted me to do an edition of the Ion." And I couldn't believe this. I still don't believe it. I can't prompt somebody like Reichsbaron to do anything. But he said, "Your point about Stesichorus, it's been bothered me for years." So I wasn't the only one.
So any more questions or remarks? If there are not, I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, if you are not too tired.
No, I'm okay. I'm
so
still thinking of Numenius.
it is not about Numenius.
Good.
Okay. So if my understanding is correct, your claim is that both amartia are of moral
significance. Yeah, you're right. Yes.
Okay. But then, how could we explain what Plotinus says just before in 4.8, chapter 5, when he says, I think it is not on the handout, but it is the line before, that one could say that the soul is sent down by God, and how could we understand what he says in 1.1 in chapter 12, that the soul's inclination towards what is below
the soul, so sorry, I missed a word, that the soul is...
The soul's inclination towards what is below cannot be said to be an amartia. So if we take both amartia in 4.8 in a moral sense, then how could we explain what he says, that it is God that sends the soul down in the case of the necessary descent? And how can we reconcile Plotinus with himself in 1.1 when he says that the soul's inclination downward is not an amartia?
You are quite right. We can't. We can't. So I would, you see, I would need to be given very strong argument for concluding that the two hamartiae are of different nature, because it really doesn't make sense if he doesn't give us a hint that they are of two different nature. Secondly, there is your own point, sent by God.
Yes, this is in 4.8, chapter 5.
Yeah.
9,
yeah.
Yes, 12 and...
Yeah. And you say, how can we reconcile that with 1.1? Well, this is something I kept up my sleeve if there was time, but clearly there wasn't. And it is the vexed question as to whether we should read the tractates in the chronological order or in the Porphyrian order. Now, most scholars in the Anglo-American world like to use the Porphyrian order. And that's how it's presented in the Loeb edition. I suppose because I was taught Plotinus in a French-speaking university, I always need to know where in the chronological order it comes. And the case of Hamartia gives me a very strong argument for taking it chronologically. I think that Plotinus knew very well when he was writing anamartētos in 1:1. He knew very well what he was doing. And in a way, it is linked to things he said before. It's not a new point. But the point about Hamartia is such a blip. And it's very strange that most scholars who have commented on 4.8, and there have been very, very great scholars commenting on 4.8, tend to slip this under the carpet. We don't talk about Hamartia. It's like a dirty word. And that's why it intrigued me. But in favor of my interpretation that it's moral in both cases, I would say that the preponderant use in Plotinus is that it's a moral. I only found 2 occurrences of in the cognitive sense, so that's very little. Gerson and his team translated as moral error. So does Breillet. I know that Breillet is not fashionable in Anglo-American circles, but that is a mistake. Breillet is very good at times, very, very good. And if you consider that he didn't have the manuscript that we have, he did a jolly good job. But Breillet takes it as a moral error in 2 cases as well. Now, that's an argument from authority, and I might disagree, and I sometimes do, but yes. I would need more arguments to say that they are of 2 different nature, but it is a very interesting point.
Can I go on?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm wondering whether a solution could be to take amartia, to distinguish between amartia as a moral error, which would be related to the voluntary descent of the soul, and amartia as a cognitive error, as a cognitive error, yes, which would be related to the necessary descent. You see, when Plotinus says that it is God who sends the soul down, then I could hardly see how this amartia can have a moral meaning. So perhaps we could see amartia as corresponding to 2 kinds of evil in Plotinus. On the one hand, metaphysical evil, on the other hand, ethical evil. So there is an amartia that is missing the point in a metaphysical sense, that is the necessary descent, which is not a moral error. And on the other hand, there is amartia as a moral error when the soul commits error here below and deep.
That's easy. A metaphysical error on the part of the soul.
Cognitive.
Yes. Well, you called it a metaphysical error.
I'm sorry.
Well, it's a cognitive error. It's a metaphysical error. You see, I mean, they are very. I mean, if you take 1.8, which is on the problem of evil, Plotinus is I think, very, very careful to avoid committing himself on the issue, because there is a passage, I couldn't quote chapter and verse, but it is in 1.8. If Anne Shepherd is here, she might tell us where it is. He writes that the soul comes close to die, something like that. But he says, but the soul never dies, because it can always go back. And there is a note by the French scholar who translated and commented on that passage, and he says, this is Laurent Lavaux actually, and he says, we must understand Plotinus' meaning here to be the death of the soul of which he's talking is ethical. It is not a metaphysical. So because of all this, and because I think you are now sailing very close to the Gnostic wind. I don't know, yeah.
Well, thank you. Are there any more questions or remarks? If there are not, then let us.
Can I just say to Professor Solder, could you send me the reference you made to something?
Yes, certainly. The Plutarch reference and some other ones. I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Suzanne, thank you very much for this talk and for the discussion, and thank you all for the discussion and for being here. Let us also renew our appointment for October and for Peter Douan's talk on the Aristotelian criticism of Plato's theory of the forms in Athenian and Alexandrian Neoplatonism. So thank you again, Suzanne. Thank you all. And a good summer to those of us who are not meeting in person very soon in Athens, Crete, and elsewhere. Thank you again.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Suzanne.